Hi, everyone. This is Oscar Hernandez. I'm the community organizer with Houston in Action. Welcome to the Community in Action Academy. Today we have our first part one training of our Dismantling Racism. And I want to I'll introduce a lot of our facilitators and the folks who will be joining us today and leading a lot of the training today in a second. But before we do that, we're going to start off our training like we do during all our meetings. This is our working principles with Houston in Action. And through a lot of our working principles, I won't read all of them, but I do want to make sure that we ground ourselves in at least one of our working principles, as we do before every single one of our trainings and meetings. And the big one that I would like to focus on today is equity and systems levels change, which means actively working to balance the civic power by changing systems that affect civic participation among communities who have been historically marginalized because of racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. And particularly focusing on this one today, as we will be talking about a really large topic around dismantling racism, what this means, but also making sure that everyone here brings their full selves into the space. And without further ado, actually, I want to pass the mic on to Kenya, who's an amazing organizer with Full Circle, and through her Hearts Deep program, we'll give you much more details. We are very fortunate to be working with Full Circle for a lot of our anti-racism work. I do want to a big shout out to those who are joining the fellowship as well, to the Okobozi Fellowship, as is a big start of how we talk about dismantling racism, anti-racism in all our spaces. So Kenya, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Oscar, and good evening, everybody. It is great to see your faces here on this Zoom. I'm excited. We're all excited to be doing this in solidarity with Houston in Action, a phenomenal network and powerhouse in helping to build a movement in Houston. And so it is an honor that we are standing beside them in bringing this opportunity here over the next couple of weeks. As he stated, I'm with Full Circle Strategies and also helping to get the RE Collective off the ground and start our first fellowship. Joining me tonight are two of our amazing team members, Denisha Cotlone and Nia Buckley, who will be also helping to facilitate this space, and you will be hearing from them soon. Heart Speak stands for any inquiring minds out there. Heart Speak, the heart stands for holistically engaging in anti-racist transformation, right? And so we believe that there are a holistic need to doing this, and it should be transformative. And so that's where that logo and that name comes from. But for the purpose of tonight, we are going to, in the very short time that we have, provide an orientation around how we understand and overcome racism. And so I want to do some acknowledgements before we get into the nitty gritty. So, you know, it is imperative for me as an anti-racist facilitator to acknowledge the shoulders on which I stand. I started this work back in 2003. And I was introduced to some amazing people in the Pacific Northwest, namely Western State Center. They are still in existence today. I was just on a call with some of them this week because everybody's talking about this horrible state bills that are being passed that are trying to like silence how we talk about systemic racism in our schools. And so Western State Center was who brought me in and trained me on how to do this and how to have and hold these very difficult but important conversations. I also received training, and a lot of our information and resources are also from Race Forward. Some of you may be familiar with Race Forward. They used to be called the Applied Research Center, and they're out of Chicago. Dismantling Racism Works is another contributor in another place in which we have learned how to talk about this and how to frame how we dismantle racism. And then there are some folks like Kenneth Jones and Andrea Avazian who have also, and Tima Okun, who have also helped some of our other facilitators as mentoring. Like, we can't do this by ourselves. We did not invent how to dismantle racism, right? We have to do this together. And so, I did not want to be misleading at no point of this presentation to give the impression that we're experts or that we created all of this. All of this comes from a culmination of work across 3 decades. So with that, this is a 2-part agenda. And so as you registered, you should have seen that you have signed up for part 1, which is tonight, and then part 2 is next week, right? And so tonight we will be focused heavily on providing some historical information on how the permeance of racism in the United States. If we can go to the next couple of slides. So tonight is really about building our language and our context about how we talk about this, right? This session will provide a very brief historical context, right? I emphasize the word brief. We only have 2 hours together. There is no way that we can cover every nook and cranny of the historical impact of racism and the experience of different people in this country. There's volumes and volumes of information. But what we hope happens is that this ignites or further pushes you along in your journey. So if you have access to pen and paper, or you have your smartphone or your tablet nearby, we really encourage you to grab that or have that ready, because there may be moments when you want to write some things down. If things are coming up and your interest has been piqued in some of the things that we're talking about, or it resonates well with you, please feel free to include that in the chat. This is a very content-heavy presentation for tonight, and so we just ask that you take deep breaths and capture what you can capture, and just really start to reflect on how you might be getting curious about this. We'll end tonight by providing some definitions on racism, and that is where we'll pause. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Denisha and Nia, who will lift up our community agreements for the space tonight.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Denisha Cotlone, and I just wanted to highlight some of our community agreements as we engage in this space together on tonight. First and foremost, we want to engage in active and deep listening, and make sure we focus on listening to understand versus react. The information and the content that we talk about today can be very heavy and cause a lot of reactions. And so we want to pay attention to those feelings and listen to understand the content, and make sure that we are focusing and actively paying attention to and focusing in on tonight's content. Then we want to focus on understanding the value of discomfort and paying attention to feelings of defensiveness. It's when we're uncomfortable that we have our biggest chance to learn something. This is especially true for those of us who are used to being in control in spaces. And those of us in power and privilege tend to have less experience with discomfort. And sometimes that feels being comfortable in our own right. And so we want to use this time and opportunity to see what our discomfort can teach us in this moment. And we also want to be self-reflective. Learning new behaviors to build culture takes growth work, and it takes practice, and mistakes will be made. So we want to encourage you to recognize your body's physical reactions and emotions that surface as they process the information. So be self-reflective instead of reactionary. And then we want you to step up and step back. For today is mostly us listening and paying attention to the content. So utilizing our capture tools, as Kenya mentioned, having your smartphone, your tablet, or a pen and writing utensil to just jot down what's coming up for you as we're going through this content on today. And then lastly, I'll just touch on confidentiality. We want this to be a safe and brave space for everyone. So we just ask that anything that's talked about in this space just stays in this space. And then I'll turn it to Nia to talk about the rest of the agreements.
Thank you, Donisha. Again, my name is Nia Buckley, and I'm with Full Circle Strategies. Thank you. So I am going to go into the other part of community agreements, which is how we want to, these are agreements that we're making collectively on how we want to be able to have this difficult conversation. And we want to make sure that we're committed to staying present right now. I know everyone has had a long day, but you know, we're committed. I'm committed to giving you a great event tonight. So I hope that you all are committed as well. And we're going to be, it's important for us to utilize I language. So when you're sharing from your perspective and not anyone else's. So authenticity and trust is required. And we want to share in ways that allow you to practice growth and be, and practice growth when you're sharing your stories. As facilitators, it is our job to encourage folks to have these conversations. So we'll do reframing, redirecting, and nudging people to learn more because it is important. And like Donisha stated, we want to do deep listening, have more authentic conversations, listen with your ears, watch with your eyes if your cameras are on. I know we're virtual, and make sure your heart is there and give your undivided attention to this event. And then if you start zoning off, catch yourself and come back, please. And we want to make sure that we're going deep. You know, we want to take risks. We don't want this superficial level of, okay, you know, I'm here, I showed up, I went to this event and that's it. We want to make sure that we take this in because we want to help folks and we want to help ourselves unlearn what we've all had in our lives. And so understand that and expect and accept that this is non-closure. So, you know, don't expect that tonight you will have all the answers to ending racism. You know, this is hundreds of years of oppressive acts, violent acts. So you won't have the answers tonight. And trust the process. This is a journey, not a sprint. Breathe. Like Donisha stated, you know, you'll have feelings of uncomfortableness, and it's important that you breathe through that and know that, you know, it's necessary because there will be some things that, you know, you possibly have never heard of before that has happened to folks in this country. And we can move on now to building a shared language. And so building a shared language is how we talk about racism. So how we talk about systemic racism, how we discuss race equity. And it's important that we all collectively have the same language when we discuss this. And so I'll get into what whiteness means. It's like the standard of everything within America. If you can go through the, okay. And then, so racism is a complex system that has been around for hundreds of years and manifests itself in multiple ways. It is not something that will go away overnight, like stated earlier. Our best hope is to do the individual and collective work to support an anti-racist society and build anti-racist institutions. Through its proliferation, racism, it has impacted each of us, and we are each complicit in its power over relationship to us, our institutions and communities. So we want to make sure that in this space that we all come together with humility, cultural humility, which is the last definition, and understand that though, you know, specifically, I want to point out, apologize, on number 3. So Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, you know, folks don't always agree with those terms. You know, some folks may see themselves as Black and not African American, or some folks don't want to be called Black. And so it's up to us to know, okay, you know, ask the person, how would you like to be identified? You know, it's important for us to ask. And even in the Latinx community, there's also those differentiations that people want to be called. And then we will move on to the next slide, which is thank you. I'm not sure who's next. Oh, here we go.
Thank you. So I just want to lift up those shared language. I think, you know, another reason why we do this, and Nia alluded to this actually, is people have different lived experiences and people come from, you know, different backgrounds and different cultures. We've been taught different things in different settings. And so it's really important for the purposes of us getting through the content, right, that we have a framework that we're working from. And so you were emailed out a list of terminology. These terms come from that list. And so really, you know, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, we'll be asking you to do that toward the end of tonight, right? So that you can take some time over the next week to really look at those terms. Some of them are gonna come up as we're speaking tonight. Some of them will come up as we're speaking next week. And so you won't, you know, we don't want to catch anybody off guard when we use a certain term or concept and you're like, what are they talking about? And so that, you know, that's another reason why we wanted to provide and build this shared language. It is also standard practice among those doing anti-racism work and racial equity work to begin engagements by saying, okay, for the purposes of what we're talking about today, here is what we mean when we say this. It is by no means an effort to shut down or discount anybody's individual experience. And so I agree with Nia, you know, in the practice and the spirit of cultural humility, we definitely want to meet people where they are and ask them and be curious about learning who they are and learning their story. So that brings us to the deep listening skills. We do want to give you all a chance to sort of loosen up and talk a bit with each other before we jump into the rest of the content. And you'll hear from Denisha and Nia again, because I really want them, they'll do some modeling for you around that, and they'll give you a chance to hear a little bit about their own journey. I do want to say, I am here and I'm present tonight as someone who identifies as a Black woman. I also go by African American, but 9 times out of 10, I say Black. I am from the Midwest. I am not a, you know, Houston native or Texan native. So I bring some different experiences to the South. And I am a Black mother of two Black children, right? I have a son and a daughter. And so at any given time, I'm not just thinking about my own experiences and my own walk, but I'm thinking about how the continuation of systemic racism plays a role and impacts the lives of my children, right? And so it makes it very personal for me to be here with you all and to do this work. And so I just wanted to share a little bit of that because I wasn't mindful to do that at the beginning. And it's important to know, like, usually when I'm at a seminar, at a workshop, I get curious about the person whose voice I'm listening to, and I want to know a little bit. And so that's a little bit about me. You're going to do an activity. And so part of this activity is about listening, right? It's about sharing a little bit of yourself, but it's also about really leaning in and hearing from that other person, right? And so we want you to really see this as an opportunity to listen for the intent of understanding and really getting to know the other person that's speaking with you. And so we like to create this space where we really pause a little bit to emphasize how important listening is, and deep listening, meaning that you are linked in and you're curious, right? And you're not making snap judgments and you're not thinking about what you're going to say, but rather really hoping to walk away having learned something from the other person. So with that, I will let Denisha and Nia set up our activity.
Yes, and thank you, Kenya, for that great introduction to this activity. So as she mentioned, we will be practicing deep listening skills and breaking into pairs. Each of you will speak for about 4 to 5 minutes on the prompts.
Hey, y'all, welcome back. Thank you for going in and having, hopefully, deep dialogue with folks that maybe you don't know, or maybe you do know and you just learned something new about them. And so if you see on the screen, this is just some reflection of your conversation that we want to kind of touch on. So as you listen, what did you notice that you had in common with the person speaking? And how does your experience differ? And if we can we have like 2 or 3 folks unmute and kind of share how your dialogue went and what you learned, what it was like to hear someone else's story, what it was like to tell your own story, and maybe what feelings emerged in that conversation.
I'd love to share, if that's okay.
Yes, thank
Okay,
you.
So Jonathan and I, we know each other, so we felt a little bit safer. We're like, okay, we know each other. It won't be such a huge risk sharing and being vulnerable. But when I was listening and when I was sharing, I realized we have a lot in common, being from religious minorities and predominantly very Baptist towns in Texas, but also loving where we grew up and being from smaller towns where everyone knew each other. One middle school, one high school, and I liked that we were able to share that connection, even though we come from different places and very different backgrounds, that we had those commonalities. And I think that being able to see parts of yourself in another person, it creates a bond and a level of trust with other people that you don't get to have if you don't have these kinds of conversations or ask these kinds of questions of each other. So I really enjoyed the activity and that it allowed us to have that kind of conversation.
I did too, Layla, and I agree with what you said, and I would add too that I thought that we both had maybe for different reasons, but kind of closely related reasons, being religious minorities and you're learning even more about kind of what it was like for you to grow up as a Muslim woman in a small town Texas, and but we both learned to kind of hide parts of our identities or let it lie low and let people just assume we're a little more mainstream than we are. And that as adults, we agree. In hindsight, we think about that, and yeah.
Thank you both for sharing. Anyone else like to share?
I can share.
Awesome.
Hi, everyone. This is Ines Siegel, and I was in a group with Rio Gonzalez, and their parents are from Mexico. And one of the things that we have in common, we both have relatives in different countries that we don't really get to see. I am from Croatia, and so I came here as a refugee. I also lived in Germany as a refugee, and so all of my relatives live abroad. And Rio's family lives in Mexico as well, and they shared that the parents are undocumented, so they can't really travel. And so it really sucks when you live far away from your family and your relatives. And so we kind of had that in common. And then we both really appreciate the food from the countries where we come from. And I think it's this, sense of comfort because you don't live there. And you're far away from, your relatives and your families, but you are able to have your culture here through food. And so we both shared our favorite dishes, and what that means to us. So thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Do we have time for one more, Kenya, or should we move on to the history part?
Maybe if people want to put some of their reflections in the chat, that would be good, and then we can move on.
Okay. If folks want to, if you don't feel comfortable unmuting, you can definitely hit the chat and just tell us your experience, And then also this last question is what assumptions might be in the way of your building relationships with the person? So sometimes, we got to be honest, like, we don't know people. And so we're just having to talk about cultural backgrounds and things like that. And it's like, it could be different. And maybe someone is like, no, I don't even eat my food from this culture, or I don't do that. And so maybe you had an assumption of this person before them even talking. So I don't know if any of you kind of thought about that too, if that kind of came up. But thank you all for sharing. We greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, Nia. And as you're thinking about if you will or will not share in the chat, I will transition into starting our conversation around the history of racism in the United States. Remember, we are underscoring the word brief, right? Humbled to do this. And this is by no means an all-encompassing collection of experiences. The goal here is to offer a glimpse into how we got here, right? As George Santa Ana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And so this is important on two fronts. One, we hope that it raises your curiosity to begin to seek out more information. And we hope that it provides you with some background and some context for how contemporary experiences impact people today, right? The relevance of history in what we're seeing and what is showing up today. So that being said, the first thing we're gonna do is look at a short video. It's just about 6 minutes, 6 or 7 minute video called The Semantics of Color. Why do we think of white as good and Black as bad? So this is an excerpt from the Black Journal, one of the first all Black journalism projects in the United States. It was publicly funded in response to the Kerner Commission in 1967, established by President Lyndon B. Johnson, in an executive order response to mounting civil unrest in 1965, which had spawned uprisings in the Black and brown neighborhoods of major US cities, including Watts in 1965, the Chicago Division Street Uprising of 1966, which was the first Puerto Rican uprising in US history, and also the 1967 Newark riots. The Kerner Commission cited inflammatory representation of riots and lack of presence in mass media as one of the sources of Black American discontent, right? So people had this negative experience, negative perception, and negative understanding of Black folks and brown folks. And a large amount of that was attributed to not being able to see any representation and not being able to see positive images being portrayed throughout the media during this time period. So President Johnson was concerned with the impact of the long, hot summer of 1967 and hoped that programs like Black Journal would prevent future riots. And so We're going to take a look at this. Pay particular attention to how people are talking about themselves and talking about this new movement, and think about how it's connected, and things may sound familiar to what we're experiencing and what we're talking about today. So I'm going to share my screen so that you all can see it.
The Semantics of Color with George Taylor.
All my life through, I've been so black and blue. I'm white inside. That don't help my case. I can't hide what is on my face. Oh, yes. Ah, yes. Just the plaintive lyrics of the blues. Yes, it's that. But the lyrics tell a familiar story. White on the inside, but black on the outside. Why? Why do we think of black as bad and white as good? An interesting question? Well, that's what the semantics of color is all about. White symbolizes purity, honesty, innocence. A white lie, told without evil intent. White-handed, hands free of evil. White-minded, mental purity. Want to impart goodness? You add white. Black represents evil, wickedness, disgrace, and gloom. Black-hearted, mean and wicked, black-mouth, foul-talking, profane. Black Tuesday, disaster. Blackball. Ha, you've had it. Want to make it bad? You add black. Even the poets used black as bad and white as good. Blake, in his Songs of Innocence, wrote, "My mother bore me in the southern wild, and I am black. But oh, my soul is white. White as the angel is the English child. But I am black, as though bereaved of light." Whites gave black its negative meaning, and with little choice, blacks accepted and helped to propagate it. And we did it mainly through our songs, such as, "What in the world did I do to be so black and blue?" The acceptance was unnoticed and for a long, long time unchallenged. And then suddenly, oh, so beautiful. Oh, so beautiful, such beautiful people. A black consciousness revolution. A revolution that is filling the need for identity and pride by taking the historical negativeness of black and using it in a strong, positive way. As is the case with many revolutions, this one is being waged by our young blacks. We asked several of them, what does the expression "black is beautiful, and it is so beautiful to be black" mean to you? They have their own unique way of expressing themselves. Listen.
It means exactly what it sounds like. Black is beautiful. It's beautiful to be black. Just like if I was white, I would say white is beautiful. It's beautiful to be white because this is a form of self-love, in my opinion. But I'm speaking just for myself. I can't speak for the whole race, but I think it's beautiful to be yourself.
And when you say black, I don't know, but it does something to me, because a lot of people are afraid of that word black. But I am not afraid of it, because if you take it for what it means, as I said to myself, black is a word that means beautiful to me and something that I really believe in for my race, because it's something that brings us together and what we want to fight for. And a lot of us are not afraid of the word black the way the majority of people are, because they don't understand it.
Well, in other words, you don't need no suntan or nothing like that to try to hide your color, because black is beautiful.
Long times ago, you used to think that being black, you were ashamed of it because you were, supposed to be brainwashed by the white man that you were inferior to him. But now, you look at yourself and you see how beautiful you are, and you don't have to feel inferior to him anymore. And so when I hear the expression Black is beautiful, I think of myself and all of my other Black brothers and sisters. And that's what I feel of Black is beautiful.
We've always been beautiful, but it's just that people are now discovering it, if that makes any sense. Like, we've always known, but people all over the world are beginning to really dig what it's all about now, and they've stopped suppressing us and they're letting us go. So I think that's basically what it means, that Black is beautiful, or it's hip to be Black, because there are quite a few white people that would love to be Black now.
For young people especially, to know the beauty in being Black, to know so much about your ancestors and the things you've done in this century, in this day, and in times past, is so, it just means so much. It's like knowing your name, your address, these fundamental things. This is what should be known to all Black people and to white people also. And when you know this, you know how truly beautiful Black is, because, I don't know, it's just too good.
And that's where it's at. You're so beautiful. Oh, so beautiful. Oh, so beautiful, such beautiful people. And you're beautiful because you're Black, 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 beautiful and Black.
So while Oscar's bringing back the slide, our presentation slide back up, I just want to name two things that I think is important to mention in this moment. The first thing I want to say is, if you think of a continuum, right, from one end of the spectrum to the other end, the very end of the spectrum is Black, the very end of the other spectrum is white, right? And so in between that are all these different and rich experiences. But make no mistake about it, there is and has always been an historical, deep-rooted resentment and anti-Blackness in this country, right? And so people ask me all the time, is this just about Black people? Are we just gonna talk about the Black experience? We need to talk about everybody's experience. We do, we absolutely do. But the relevance of naming anti-Blackness has to be important to everybody here, because policies and the ways in which we have treated everybody all stem from that spectrum. And that is important to know. You had to create policies and make laws to even get access to the media and be portrayed in a positive way on the media, right? And so for some of us who fall on the younger end, like we're in younger generations, and things are just, you turn on the TV and there people are. Or you go out in this beautiful diverse city we like to refer to as Houston, and you see people everywhere. But there is a story that goes with every single blood stained experience that has happened in this country. And if we lose sight of that, it is going to undermine our ability to truly build solidarity across these different groups. So that is very, very important to understand, right? And so with that, I want to turn it over to, I believe it's Denisha, if I'm not mistaken, or Nia, to take us into these different steps, these different iterations of history. And so we'll all be sharing important information for you to think about and for you to lift up. We definitely want this to be about everybody here in this experience thinking about the erasure, the invisibility, and the distortion of history that has happened in this country, right? And so many of us, I'm sure, can tell a story about how they don't see themselves in their workspace. They don't see themselves on television, or just their walk or their migration or immigration into this country has not been something that is worth celebrating because of how they have been persecuted or oppressed, right? All of those stories are important. And to truly understand and show up for people, we have to really dig into this insidious history of how we got here and the way that policy was deliberately constructed to oppress not only Black folks, but our Indigenous brothers and sisters who were here before anybody, right? And everybody else who sought out to seek this land. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nia to kick us off.
Thank you, Kenya. That was powerful. And so I'll talk about the pre-slavery days. And so it's important for us to be aware of how this all came to existence. So religion and the church played a fundamental role in the construction of race and racism. The story of the curse of Ham in the book of Genesis, Noah's son, was cursed with blackness for seeing his father naked. It was used historically to justify slavery, colonization, and genocide of people of color. It provided the foundational argument for generations of white supremacy and for violence and racism against Blacks and people of color as ordained by God. So during the 15 and 1600s, a 100-year debate enraged in Europe on whether indigenous people and Black folks were animals with humans with souls. Father Bartholomew de las Casas wrote a short account of the destruction of the Indies and Historia de las Indias, the apologetic summary history of the people of these Indies that chronicled the first decades of colonization and described the atrocities committed by the colonizers against the indigenous peoples. The first Africans, actually from what we now call Angola, who were enslaved in the US, were brought to Virginia in 1619. With the racialization of the slave trade in the 1680s, Europeans began using the word Blacks for the first time. Over time, colonial laws granted English and Irish indentured servants greater privileges than Africans who worked alongside them, which fused a new identity, that of being white, the polar opposite of Black. So this is when they started to come, and it was no longer separate from I'm Irish and you're English. Now it's like you're white, you're Black. The colonists created an extreme form of slavery that existed nowhere else in the world. For the first time in history, one category of humanity was ruled out of the human race and into a subgroup to be enslaved in perpetuity. At the height of slavery, the monetary value of the enslaved people were worth more than all combined factories and railroads in the US. And this is from the 1619 Project. In Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, it has a dedication that reads 60 million and more in the memory of the Africans and their descendants who died as a result of the Atlantic slave trade. And please know that this is growing. And it continues to happen with similar folks like Andrew Brown, the brother that was shot by police in North Carolina on April 21st. And also I like to, when I read this, a quote came to mind also from Toni Morrison. She states, in this country, American means white. Everybody else has to hyphenate. And then also mentioned previously, for European immigrants arriving here, becoming American meant becoming white. And that was by James Baldwin. So nobody was white before they came to America. And also, it is important to note is that African nations have had sophisticated studies of science, medicine, literature, agriculture, art, astrology, long before religious missionaries and European explorers began colonizing the countries. Much of that history was lost upon the extinction of scholars from disease brought by Europeans to the African continent and through various wars on the continent to destroy the culture of the indigenous people. There are records of these texts dating back to 4 BC and throughout Egyptian history as recorded in the pyramids. Donisha would now go to the next slide about post-slavery.
Thank you, Nia. That's heavy, right? So 12 generations of slavery ended in 1865. And I pause there because it's heavy, right? But afterwards, nearly 2,000 Black Americans were lynched during the Reconstruction period alone. More than 4,000 African Americans were killed in racial terror lynchings between 1877 and 1950. Native Americans, children, and women in all 50 states were also lynched during this time. Many of these extrajudicial murders were celebratory public spectacles. So they were used as entertainment, where thousands of white people, including elected officials and prominent citizens, gathered to witness victims being gruesomely tortured and mutilated. White newspapers advertised these like carnival events. Vendors sold food, photographers printed postcards, and victims' clothing and body parts were given out as souvenirs. Reconstruction also ended hopes of formerly enslaved people making a living off the land. The idea of 40 acres and a mule came from Sherman's march to the sea. Enslaved people were freeing themselves by leaving the plantations and joined his army. He had zero compassion as he was a racist. They had to be fed and they were slowing him down. They came to a creek and he asked them to help build a bridge, saying that once the army crosses, they could too. So his army crossed and Sherman ordered that the bridge be destroyed before the others could cross. And they were massacred by the Confederate Army. The press and North were outraged, and formerly enslaved people were summoned to Washington to ask them what could they do, and rightfully so, they demanded land. William Seward and President Lincoln supported that, and Sherman issued a field order in January 1865 to allow no more than 40 acres per family, and the mule will come later. After Lincoln's assassination, his successor, Andrew Johnson, who was a Southern sympathizer, overturned the order 6 months after Sherman issued it and returned all the land to former plantation owners. Black farmers in the South have faced decades of discrimination in loans and other supports ever since. In spite of that, for a brief time after emancipation, free Black communities spread across the rural South, cultivating all manner of agricultural goods, pecans, peanuts, and pork. By 1920, there were 925,000 Black farmers, a fourth of whom were able to secure their own land. Farms run by African Americans make up less than 2% of all the nation's farms today, down from 14% in 1920, because of decades of racial violence and unfair lending and land ownership policies. Jim Crow laws were then ushered to legalize segregation in schools, housings, jobs, and every other aspect of American life, seeking to tear away the major gains Black made during Reconstruction, despite everything that was meant to tear them down the major gains that they did gain were combated by the Jim Crow laws. And they remained in the books until 1965, which was relatively 56 years ago. So not that long ago. Next slide.
So, and this is where I think a lot of the discussions about where is America's original sin came from. When most times people talk about it, the popular subject that comes up is slavery and the treatment of Black people. But where, if you look at the context of America's quote unquote original sin, it had to do with the ethnic cleansing of the millions of indigenous people that live in this land. And actually, if you go through almost any museums, you might even find timelines of a lot of indigenous people that end hundreds of years ago, well knowing that a lot of the descendants of the people are still living today. I remember being in high school when I first heard the word manifest destiny, which sounded like such an amazing word, to be defined later on as their God-given right to take the land out of the indigenous people. It was discussed earlier as well about the idea of how the church has been involved in not classifying indigenous people as humans. There is an amazing in a horrible way, a doctrine called the doctrine of discovery, in which the Catholic Church actually split the lands between the Spanish and the Portuguese people, where they said if there was no Christians in the land here, then nobody here is human, and they had every right to take the land from the people. I invite you to please look it up to see that a lot of the context that was given into why they justify the taking of indigenous people's lands. And even throughout history, the Native people were not actually recognized as American citizens and had the right to vote until even after post-slavery. And many times when people think about indigenous people, or better yet, when they think about Abraham Lincoln, they mention about how he freed the slaves. Well, in the same context, over 300 Sioux indigenous people were sentenced to death by hanging, and over 38 of it were hung during the Lincoln administration. Well, analyzing this is also to mention how a lot of the land that was once belonged to Mexico, while it was building its country through Spanish rule, was taken by the US. And a lot of the people who lived in the US were indigenous people, did identify as Mexican. And that's when the phrase of the border didn't cross, we didn't cross the border crossed us, is not just a metaphor, it's a literal stance in history. There is amazing studies that have shown the amount of time that an effort that have been put to negate the rightful ownership of land for both indigenous people as well as Mexicans, who are now called Mexican Americans in Texas. They would have signs, they would say that this, in English, saying that if they wanted to claim their land, they had to go to court. And they would do things where they would put them on the door, and when people opened the door to go to the courtroom, it would hide the signs that said when their court days and who should show up and when the deadline was. So when somebody came in there, didn't speak English, asking about the information, they would act like they didn't know what they were talking about. And a lot of the people lost their lands. Actually, San Antonio is riddled with a lot of cemeteries dedicated to a lot of these people who lost their lands and who lost their livelihood. And while this had happened throughout the history of Texas with its indigenous people, it's important to remember that the influence of both the reservations that developed in the US that brought in a lot of indigenous people to separate it from the lands and move, not only through the Trails of Tears, but really move them from the native land, the places that they protected, into these reservations, was later actually used by the Nazis, and even Hitler had basically gained inspiration through the treatment of these concentration camps to create the concentration camps that developed during the Holocaust, which is a really a deep rooted inception of this US, has always been rooted in racism and the genocide of people. And it really makes a question about how they teach history in the US, because at that same point, as we're constantly told that the US helped defeat Hitler, at the same time, the discussions of the practices that have done and the genocides of the indigenous people here in the US is not as recognized, and the atrocities that were made here are as equal measure to what happened to the Jewish communities.
Thank you, Oscar. So the history of anti-Asian discrimination and violence is the history of America. Namely, the idea that Asians belong in Asia is a major part of America past and present. Hence the question at the top of the screen. So where are you from? A question that just anecdotally, I've witnessed and heard people, AAPI individuals saying people are always asking, so where are you from, right? And so there has been this very blatant historical just feeling and pressure and oppression of not acknowledging and not including them into what we call America, right? East Asian people have historically been viewed as an existential danger to the Western world. The promotion of racism against Chinese people, or this idea of nativism, or the favoring of native-born Americans over immigrants, was directly tied together and antecedent to the late 1800s. There is something that is often referred to as yellow peril. It's a type of racism that provoked the Chinese massacre of 1871 in Los Angeles, wherein 500 white men lynched 20 Chinese men in Chinatown. Even pausing here to just note that we use the terminology, like just even in the terminology that we use, like Chinatown, right? In ways that just are really reinforce this idea of them being separate. A mob of 3,000 whites destroyed Denver's Chinatown, injuring several and killing one Chinese worker in 1880. Burnings all over the West, including in Nevada. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first significant law restricting immigration into the United States. Passed to placate worker demands and prevalent concerns about maintaining white racial purity. It banned Chinese from entering US and prohibited Chinese immigrants already in America from becoming citizens. During World War II, 120,000 other Japanese Americans were held in 11 detention centers during this time, 2/3 of whom were US citizens. Also, the government seized $6 billion of their assets in 1988 paid $20,000 to each internment camp for survival. There are important parallels between European and Asian immigration history, especially in terms of how individuals responded to the pushes and pulls in their homeland, and then faced contradictory experiences of discrimination and opportunity in the US. However, the push-pull model commonly used to explain European immigration, like the melting pot paradigm of immigrant assimilation, does not fully explain the fundamental differences in patterns of Asian immigration and exclusion. These differences can only be understood by recognizing critical features of the historical period, including the reality of Western colonialism and unequal power relations in Asia, the insatiable need for cheap labor that accompany manifest destiny, westward expansion, and economic development in the United States, and the influence on social policy and public attitudes that resulted from lack of knowledge about Asian people and racist notions of white superiority. Co-founding the situation further are the stereotypes and distorted depictions of Asian Americans in movies, televisions, advertising, cartoons, and other media, as well as school textbook and children's literature. In 1991, the Asian American Journalists Association released a study titled Project Zinger, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which documented a wide range of stereotypic depictions of Asian Americans in print media from around the country. Historical images such as the treacherous Fu Manchu, the exotic erotic Susie Wong, and the inscrutable Charlie Chan, coupled with the contemporary depictions of Japanese tourists and samurai businessmen, the dog-eating refugee on welfare, offer little value in clarifying the identities and realities of Asian Americans. Yet these pervasive stereotypes continue to shape how many parents, teachers, administrators, and students perceive members of the AAPI community and how Asian Americans often view themselves. To many, the resulting lack of awareness was highlighted after the March 16 Atlanta spa shootings that left 6 women of Asian descent dead. The killings fit into a larger trend of violence against Asians, failing to be seen or charged as a hate crime. Even as leaders lamented that racist attacks are not who we are as Americans. Note that the first 2 weeks of March, there were an average of 100 hate crimes per day against AAPI individuals, but the shootings represented the peak of a more than a year of increased reports of anti-Asian harassment and discrimination. The tragedy was also a part of a more than 150-year-old history of anti-Asian racism and violence in the United States. There are a few terms to highlight to help contextualize the complexity and nuance that exists in current conversations about how we stand in solidarity with the AAPI community and in how we recognize these and other stories that have gone untold for so many decades. I want to lift up a couple of terms. First, the definition of assimilation, because I think that, you know, what has been crystallized in this moment is many individuals are stepping into their own power and liberating themselves from this historical pressure to assimilate into American culture, right? And some of those individuals are representative in the AAPI community. And so if you've been paying attention, people are talking about losing their American name and holding close to the name that they were, you know, their birth name that they were given, and all sorts of ways in which they want to be seen for them whole selves and not continue to be caught up in this idea of assimilation. But you got to also understand that all of this comes from this long historical trajectory of how we treated people who have come over here. Another term I want to lift up is distortion, right? The selective presentation and false representation of the lives and histories of a particular group of people. So much of what most Americans know or think they know about different cultures, AAPI included, is distorted information, right? Which leads also to the invisibility, which is the last term I'll lift up. Ignoring or denying the existence, histories, and achievements of certain groups of people, most reinforced through our teaching or non-teaching within the US education system. I saw a lot of people put in the schools experiences in the chat. The absence of visibility gives the impression that aside from a few exceptional people, these groups have no history, no story, and therefore we're not doing anything worth discussing. Students can literally go through their whole educational life not hearing a single fact or historical reference to Asians in this country. And so I know Oscar had some things that he wants to lift up, so I will pause and just kick it back to him, and then he'll transition to the next slide.
Yes, and I think for this, it's important to understand what is encompassed by AAPI, as we definitely want to take the approach and talk about what a lot of East Asian communities have faced, but also recognizing what happens in South Asia, and even in many cases, AAPI encompasses a lot of both Middle Eastern, and depending on the year you're in and how people view these ideas of race or nationality, it can even go into a lot of Arab communities as well. And one of the points that I like to bring up when it comes into analyzing the history of race in the US is there is a scientist that made up this whole theory about how humanity actually started pre-Bible era, and that there's different kinds of species of people that developed. And within those species, he divided that basically white people were the humans and everyone else was divided into the other 4 categories. And because of this line of thought, and because of how it embedded based on how the US was created even within its laws, there was a really interesting case of George Shisham. He was an Arab police officer who arrested a white man for a violation, and the white man said he could not be arrested by George Shisham because he wasn't white. And this case actually made it all the way to the Supreme Court. George Shisham, though he would say identify as an Arab, the Supreme Court identified him as a Mongoloid because they believed in that the scientific idea of these different species. And it's a very amazing case if you check out one of his responses. And this actually brings me to two great points. One that I've heard through a lot of the work we did around census is that why are Middle Eastern people categorized as white? And to the constant debate within religious folks of why is Jesus portrayed as a white man? Well, in this Supreme Court case, I want to get his actual quote right. His response was, if I am Mongolian, then so is Jesus, because Jesus came from the same land. So, and that's why the Supreme Court classified him as white, so they can classify Jesus as white as himself. And I'll add some more context within the chat too, if you want to look it up. But to me, like when we encompass what we mean by AAPI and the enormity of like what this term means and how it covers a huge geographical area of people, is also to understand how big the impact and how we when we talk about race and what this means. And the last thing I'll say around even the terms around AAPI and to what was brought up around Black and African American, and even right now there is a constant debate on whether people should be identified as Latino or Latinx. And then many people prefer the term Chicano as a recognition of where they come from. And there's a lot of Native people who do not actually like the word Latino or Latinx because they believe it negates the identity of indigenous people, as where it points to the history of the Latino or Latinx population as some Eurocentric Latin term versus their indigenous identity. So there's a lot of complexities as when we analyze like what these terms mean and how we're trying to encompass everybody. But from there, a big thing that we wanted to talk about is not just the historical context of things that have happened decades and decades ago, but to what's been happening here in the US. As early as 1999, James Byrd Jr., who you see here, was actually hung by 3 white supremacists. They tied him to the back of the truck and he died through the injuries that they dragged his body. That happened in Jasper, Texas, which is probably about an hour away from where we stand here in Houston. It's still also recognized and known as a sundown city, where if you're not white, you probably shouldn't be driving around the area when the sun is down. And it's important to recognize how when we think about these things, it's almost the idea that they happened to people a long time ago when they're continuous occurrences that continue to happen to people today. John Horn, who you see here in June of 2008, he shot 2 Black immigrant people who were committing burglary in a neighbor's home. While he was on a call with the police actually told him not to get involved. Joe Horn, said that he had a gun and that the laws had changed, so he should be able to interfere. They told him repeatedly, I believe it was over 12 times, to not get involved, and he decided to go over there and shoot these 2 people in the back. Both of them died because of this shooting, and Joe Horn was later not convicted of any of the cases of murder, and he was even hailed through a lot of conservative spaces and a lot of gun-owning places as a hero and was rallied, and until today, he's still in Pasadena. In 2016, Nathan DeCia had some issues in an apartment complex that he lived in. This is really close to Southwest Houston, which is really close to the Galleria area. He had an issue with a lot of the people who were remodeling the apartment complex in which he lived in, and he took out a gun and pointed it at the people who were remodeling the home, and because they couldn't prove that he actually pointed the gun at him, he was let go, only to sometime later drive through the streets and randomly started shooting at people while wearing a Nazi uniform. It was full garb Nazi uniform, but when they put his photo up on the news, you would see him smiling as an intellectual man. And this is also of how the recognition of the people is portrayed in media and how the impact and how clearly a lot of this is intended in a way to almost not really bring up the issue that we're facing right now because of the beliefs and the ideas of what's been happening. In 2018, in Sugarland, for those who might not know, Sugarland was named Sugarland because they had a lot of sugar canes there, and there was in post-slavery through the Jim Crow era, they had to figure out a way to continue to grow and build sugar cane there. So what they did is that they would quote unquote rent out prisoners to pick the sugar canes. In doing so, a lot of the prisoners who were there were actually slaves, treated as slaves, but because of the Jim Crow era and because of the idea of slavery is ended and we can ultimately treat criminals any way we want to, even to exploit their lives and use them for labor. Over 60 people died inside that sugarcane field, and most of them were actually buried underneath there. Today's school was being built above that land, and in 2018 they actually found the bones, and they found shackles and chains that were used on the prisoners who lived in that land. They built a school on top of it, but still refused to let people study the bones to actually affirm who are the bones belong to, and that really shows how, like, in some weird, disgusting, like, poetic irony about how even today, as I've seen a lot in the chat, we're discussing about how they're not allowing, or they're trying to pass laws to not allow people to talk about critical race theory. This is literally a school that was built over the bones of enslaved people who were prisoners. And even the people in that school will not be taught about or at least if they had their way, would not allow the teachings of the people who died in that school. So keeping in context about like how these atrocities have been happening since the inception of this country, but at the same time, not only how they affect us today, but as we can see through January 6th with the insurrection and the terrorist groups who went into the White House. There was a police officer there that was from Houston, Texas. And then recognizing that last year was the anniversary of George Floyd, a Native Houstonian's murder, how these things continue to affect us and they're alive and present today as they were in the past.
Thank you, Oscar. It's a lot. Just the last thing you said was just so profound. The contrast of lifting up that space, that land, and that school being built on that land. What we want you to do right now is reflect a little bit. I know people have been excited in typing into the chat, but we want you to really just sort of sit a little bit with what you've heard, what you've been listening to, and whether or not it's hitting you a certain way or resonating in a certain manner. And so if you have a way to write down your thoughts, we want to encourage you to do that at this time. If you want to just kind of reflect mentally, we want to do that. But this is just a time to just pause and just sort of sit with all of these different experiences, which just is really probably, I don't even know if we talked about I don't even know what the percentages of what we talked about. I'm sure it doesn't even register in terms of all of the things that have happened across this country and in Texas. So we can just pause for a few minutes before we transition into the final piece of today. I feel compelled to share, and I hope, and Oscar, you can chime in, because I want to say this is along the lines of what you were hoping we would lift up during this moment. There was recently, Karina Walters is a Choctaw member of the Choctaw Nation and is also a Indigenous scholar and does a lot of research on the experiences of Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest and in the Midwest region. And one of the things that she had been particularly interested in as of late is the Trail of Tears, which we didn't even get a chance to touch on tonight, right? The forced movement from the east to the west of different indigenous tribes, particularly Choctaw. So what she decided to do, she had been working with different indigenous women around their birthing experiences and depression and all sorts of things related to what it's like to live in this land, given the history and the heaviness of it, and all of the oppression and the annihilation and the sacrifices that their people have made here. So they decided that they were going to re-walk the Trail of Tears. So they do this, right? They do this like about 3 years ago. They re-walked the Trail of Tears, literally. So they started in, I want to say like in Arkansas, Tennessee area, and they just moved through whatever that trail was supposed to be. In the process of them doing it, about halfway through it, because there were definitely moments where they stopped and paused and reflected and talked about what they knew about their history and all the things that have been shared and passed down. But about halfway through that experience, a revelation occurred for them in the fact that they was able to recognize that even through all this pain and all this historical trauma that they've endured, there were other things happening along that Trail of Tears. There were babies that were born on the other end of the Trail of Tears. You know, people were connecting and supporting each other and holding each other. And they had to remember that while we talk about all this pain and all this suffering, there are glimpses and there are these opportunities and these lifelines that also remind us why we're here and why we have been put in these spaces to do this work, right? And it was just so incredibly impactful to hear her talk in her own experience about just the aha moments of, it is absolutely true, the devastation that racism has caused us. And it is also true, the ways in which we continue to persevere and continue to try to find our way, make our way, reclaim and liberate ourselves. So I just wanted to throw that out because it is a lot to reflect on in hoping that this is about starting a journey or continuing a journey for many of us, right? Okay, so we want to shift to defining, putting some terminology, some more terminology out there that directly connects to this term racism. And I know the chat is going to light up because there's already been conversations about all sorts of things. And so if we can go to the next slide, I think that's the next slide. Yes, okay. So there are a couple of different definitions up here. And so part of this is to give you our philosophical and ideological perspective on how we talk about this and how we do this. It is definitely an opportunity for you to think and see if it's something that you recognize. Think about ways in which you may have talked about or understood the definition of racism. I do want to reflect back on an earlier term and just to underline and underscore that race is a false classification. It's a social political construct, right? Not based on any scientific or biological truth. And we have to say that because for a time period, there were actual scientists documenting racial difference between the brains of white folks and the brains of folks of color. That is a part of this history. And we have held on to that in ways that sometimes that don't even resonate with us, right? And so when we're in clinical and healthcare settings and we assume that a person of color doesn't feel pain or has a higher tolerance of pain and therefore should not be given the proper care that they need for the procedure that they're going through or for the giving birth, that is a reflection of this thought process that was put out there years ago, decades ago, right? And it's still fostering and festering and building and manifesting in different ways, right? When we make assumptions that people of color are not in spaces because of their own merit and intellect, we are reflecting on the way in which we have socially constructed race to assert that white folks have an inherent intellectual superiority over others, right? Racism is different from racial prejudice, hatred, or discrimination. It is more than an individual act of meanness, right? Prejudice is an attitude based on limited information, often stereotypes. Prejudice is usually, but not always, negative. Positive and negative prejudice alike, right? We can have a bias toward or bias away from people, right? Especially when directed toward oppressed people, prejudice is damaging because they deny the individuality of the person. In some cases, the prejudice of oppressed folks are necessary for survival. So when we're talking about the disdain or the discontent that we have against law enforcement, or if we're talking about how we feel about doctors in hospital settings, right? That particular attitude could stem from a person's experience being oppressed in those systems, right? And so wanted to make clear, because sometimes when we get to this slide, the hair splitting begins, right? People start to split hairs in terms of, well, what about people who say this and what about people who do this? So I want to just be clear around there are all different ways in which our biases and our prejudices manifest. But having power in itself, wait, let me back up and say, racism, the way in which we're defining it, has to do with social and institutional power plus the prejudice, right? So it's not the prejudice alone, it's not the institutional or social power alone, it is the combination of those two things that ultimately equals a system of advantage based on race, a system of oppression based on race, and a system of white supremacy. Having power alone does not confer racism. In the US, there is only one racial group that has the overwhelming social and institutional power that confers access to resources, the ability to influence others, access to decision makers to get what you want done, the ability to define reality for yourself and others. And when people use their position of power, be it political or institutional, to reinforce their prejudice and to enforce them so that as a result of their racial prejudice, the life chances, rights, and opportunities of others are limited, and the result is racism. So racism then involves one group having the power to carry out systemic discrimination through major institutions of society. By this definition, only white people can be racist in our society because only white people as a group have that power. And so the ways in which the structures, system, policies, and procedures of institutions in the US are founded upon and then promote, reproduce, and perpetuate advantages for white people and the oppression for Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color. These institutions legislate and structure reality to advantage white people and oppress BIPOC. We'll talk next week more about specific institutions and provide examples about specific institutions. But I want to just, as you're hearing me speak to these definitions and being very clear about how we approach this conversation, right? Being very clear. It's very important that our terminology is consistent and is reflective of the systemic and institutional experiences that we know are true in this country, right? And so I know that in lay term and when we're talking to one another, we may say, oh, that's racist, what you said. And fine, you know, semantics plays a role in this. But when we're thinking about dismantling and how we undo these systems, we have to bring attention to the fact that white folks, it is within their power and in their agency that to be racist, right? Just think about the bills that are up in Texas legislature. These are clear examples of the use of white supremacy to further perpetuate the agenda that reinforces us not talking about this stuff, keeping it invisible, keeping it distorted, right? Not letting people tell their story or discouraging people from telling their story to avoid shining a light on whatever it is, right? And so this is the last piece of our tonight's discussion, right? We usually end on the racism definitions, but what we look forward to doing tomorrow is having a chance to engage in a dialogue about what has come up as you reflected overnight and throughout the day tomorrow about what you heard, right? And so that's another reason why we do it in 2 parts, because we recognize that it's pretty content heavy to get all this information out there. And we really want to have that dedicated time for folks to be able to listen to each other, right? And to hear each other and to ask additional questions. If you can think about, right, between now and the next time we do the training, which would be next Wednesday, just think about and reflect on what this means for you. Okay, so now what? What's the so now what for you? And if that conjures up questions, please bring those questions and reactions to the dialogue session tomorrow. If you had not had a chance to look at the Building the Shared Language document that was emailed to you, now might be a good time to start perusing through that and looking at some of that terminology. Questions may rise just out of looking at that. There is a video that we are going to talk about again tomorrow, and so you don't necessarily have to watch the video tonight for tomorrow. You don't need to have looked at the video for tomorrow's dialogue session. Let me just state that. But you should have the link on the document with the shared language. We will also share the video in the link tomorrow. The other thing that we like to do is ask for an evaluation, get feedback from folks. And so we'll be sharing a link where you can provide your feedback on both day one or week one. Let's just call it week one since it's a 2-day conversation, and then again for week 2. So those are things that you can look forward to tomorrow. We will be paired up. So there are 4 of us today, and so we'll be in pairs to help facilitate those conversations and allow people the chance to hear and share with one another. I will say, even though we'll be in a smaller group, it's only an hour. And so it's really going to be important that we not set like these high expectations that we're gonna go deep and have these long, deep, drawn out conversations. This is just intended to give you some time to process and share the information. Process and share and reflect on the information that was provided today. Oscar, I think Oscar can make sure all of you all have that document. And so yes, absolutely, you'll get that to your inbox.
Yes.
Oscar, Denisha, or Nia, I'll turn it over to y'all. So if you guys want to share any, I know Oscar, I think you had something that you wanted to share as a closing. But Denisha and Nia, did you want to jump in there before Oscar takes it home?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for being here and look forward to tomorrow's dialogue.
Same here. Thank y'all. And I hope that y'all got something out today and, you know, use your capture tools, and we'll be here tomorrow.
Well, as we close out the session today, I do want to say that even though a lot of the content and information that we shared today is a very heavy experience, I can say from someone who's been through a lot of racial justice trainings, this is probably some of the hardest part, is consistently reviewing the history and then analyzing where I fit in it, as many of y'all probably did today. And then a recognition of the struggles that we face today, and where it's not rooted from our own self-responsibility. It's really rooted in between a larger historical narrative. I will say that by participating, like, one of the big hopes is that we can also learn best ways that we can heal and manage the spaces of what we learned. And I hope that tomorrow alleviates something from what you learned today. One of my biggest concerns of always participating and even leading in some of these sessions is that I really hope that people don't leave only feeling angry. If you feel angry or upset, I completely understand, but that shouldn't be the only feeling that you get. I often say that within the spaces and recognizing what this is, like, these systems end up, even learning about this puts a lot of our youth and a lot of the people that participate in a very depressive and enraged state. And I truly believe that that is the intention, even in many cases, by allowing us to participate in the space, so we can be even more lost. But if we can take this approach of listening, reflecting, and truly coming back tomorrow with your thoughts, your analogy, and then what you were able to reflect from now to then, and then bringing that into a space, I hope it can provide a space of healing and reflection, not only as a place of contention. I would say that with a lot of younger folks, when they come in, you know, and we end up having to analyze the history, and in many cases, this is one of the first times that you ever learn even about their own history, or get to view things a little differently, and to that degree, to recognize who you are, starting from a point of pain and agony, is such a horrible place to be in. So I hope every one of you know that you're not doing this alone, that you're in a community, and the community that we help to support and build off of. Through the work that we're doing with Full Circle, we're also building off our Okumbazi Fellowship, and I see some of the fellows participated today, which I'm really happy to see some of y'all who signed up. As we go through that process and be able to participate, we hope to grow and learn and be able to provide spaces like this more and more. As they close off, one thing that comes to mind specifically is I was listening to a discussion about the writings of George Baldwin, and one of the things that really gets to me is an interview he had with Esquire, when there's this amazing writer who was actually analyzing it, and he analyzed it for me in such a beautiful way. When he mentioned that he was asked, when it comes to the issues about racism, that why is he, and I'm butchering this completely, but I'll make sure to share the through line episode so y'all can take a moment to hear it. When Baldwin was asked, isn't it true that you're why you're fighting so hard on this when your people are dying? And Baldwin responded by, we're just dying faster. And what he meant to say with that approach is that this idea of white supremacy isn't only killing or people of color. In his specific context, it's only killing Black people. It's this morphing white people, and it's the idea of this white supremacy, like, it harms everyone who participates in, as in you lose your humanity by embedding this idea of that other people are less than human and you are greater than. And that reflection to me has helped me a lot in doing this work, as it is not an intention to call out every single white person for every single thing that they did. as well as it's not an intention for every single person of color to feel that they should always be mad about these things. It's really understanding that these principles and these white supremacist ideas harm everybody. So with that notion, I invite you all to please reflect on a lot of this and come back tomorrow. We would love to talk to you. I would love to hear a lot more from you, and we thank you for joining this space. I will be emailing you the language forms for those of you who might not have gotten it, as well as we will be emailing you the video for those who have time to review the culture humanity. So thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see you again tomorrow.